Of the estimated 200,000 French civilians who actively resisted Nazi occupation, over 80,000 were women. Yet their stories remain largely untold. Hidden behind aprons and flour-dusted hands, these invisible warriors carried secrets that would change the course of history. Today, we uncover one such story that unfolded in the seemingly peaceful village of Saint-Rémy, where the scent of fresh bread masked the most dangerous espionage operation the Germans never saw coming. Comment below and tell us your state. How do you think you would have responded under such circumstances? The morning of June 15th, 1942, dawned like any other in Saint-Rémy, a small village nestled in the Loire Valley of occupied France. The cobblestone streets, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, now echoed with the heavy boots of Wehrmacht soldiers. Yet at 4:30 a.m., while the village still slept under the suffocating blanket of Nazi rule, a single window glowed warmly in the darkness. Inside the Moreau bakery, 22-year-old Elise Moreau worked silently beside her father, Henri, their hands moving with practiced precision through dough that would soon become the day's bread. The ancient wood-fired oven, built into the stone wall generations ago, radiated heat that seemed to push back against the cold reality outside their door. This ritual had continued unchanged for 3 years of occupation, a small act of normalcy in a world turned upside down. Elise's delicate features and quiet demeanor had always made her nearly invisible to the German officers who frequented the bakery. They saw only what they expected to see, a simple village girl, dutiful and unremarkable, whose greatest concern appeared to be ensuring their morning pastries were perfectly golden. Her dark hair, always neatly pinned beneath a white cotton cap, framed eyes that seemed to hold nothing more dangerous than recipes passed down through generations. But on this particular morning, as Elise shaped the loaves with flour-dusted fingers, something extraordinary was taking place. Hidden within the innocent curves of each baguette, invisible to the naked eye, lay secrets that could determine the fate of Allied bombing missions across northern France. The very bread that would grace Nazi breakfast tables carried intelligence that could save thousands of lives. The technique was deceptively simple, taught to her just weeks earlier by a man who claimed to be nothing more than a flour supplier from Tours. Using a thin needle, Elise would pierce the bread at specific intervals during the final rising stage. The tiny holes, barely perceptible once baked, formed patterns that corresponded to German troop movements, supply depot locations, and defensive positions. Each loaf was a coded message, each delivery route a communication line stretching across occupied territory. As the first light of dawn crept through the bakery's windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden table, Elise carefully arranged the morning's batch in wicker baskets. To any observer, she appeared to be simply organizing bread for delivery. In reality, she was orchestrating one of the most audacious intelligence operations in the region. The sound of approaching boots on cobblestone interrupted the morning quiet. Through the frosted glass of the bakery door, the distinctive silhouette of German uniforms became visible. Elise's heart quickened, but her hands remained steady as she wiped flour from her apron. This was the moment that came every morning, the test that determined whether she would see another sunset. The door chimed as 3 Wehrmacht soldiers entered, bringing with them the scent of tobacco and leather polish. Their eyes, cold and calculating despite their cordial smiles, swept across the bakery's interior with practiced assessment. These were not mere foot soldiers but intelligence officers, trained to detect the subtle signs of deception that most would miss. "Guten Morgen, Fräulein Moreau," the lead officer said, his French heavily accented but precise. "The usual selection for Hauptmann Müller's breakfast, if you please." Elise nodded silently, reaching for the specific loaves she had prepared for this moment. Each one appeared identical to the others, but she knew exactly which contained the intelligence that would soon make its way to resistance fighters hiding in the forests surrounding Orléans. Her movements were deliberate but natural, the performance of a young woman who had learned to hide revolution behind routine. As the officers departed with their deadly cargo, Elise allowed herself a moment to breathe. Through the window, she watched them disappear down the narrow street, their polished boots clicking against stone that had witnessed Roman legions, medieval merchants, and now Nazi occupiers. Each set of conquerors had believed their rule would last forever. All had eventually learned otherwise. The morning delivery rounds would begin soon, carrying her father's bread and her encrypted messages to contacts throughout the valley. But first, there was the daily ritual of sweeping flour from the bakery floor, a task that allowed her to think and plan while maintaining the appearance of simple domestic duty. As her broom moved across the worn wooden planks, Elise reflected on how quickly life had changed since the armistice 2 years earlier. The village that had once been her entire world had become a stage where every interaction was performance, every smile a potential betrayal. The neighbors she had known since childhood now included informants who would sell their own mothers for an extra ration of butter. Yet within this landscape of suspicion and fear, something remarkable was taking root. Ordinary people were choosing to become extraordinary, transforming their mundane daily activities into acts of resistance that would ripple across continents. The baker's daughter was becoming a spy, and the Germans would never suspect until it was far too late. But even as Elise prepared for another day of dangerous deception, she could not have imagined the test that lay ahead. The war was about to reach into her small world, with claws sharper than any she had yet faced, and the price of resistance was about to become devastatingly personal. The transformation of France had not happened overnight. When Wehrmacht columns first rolled across the Belgian border on May 10, 1940, they carried with them a blueprint for conquest that had been perfected through years of expansion across Europe. The blitzkrieg that shattered French defences in just 6 weeks left behind more than military defeat. It created a psychological wasteland where hope itself became a form of resistance. By the summer of 1942, Saint-Rémy bore little resemblance to the village Elise had known before the war. The ancient market square, once filled with laughter and the cheerful haggling of farmers selling their produce, now hosted mandatory assemblies where Vichy officials read proclamations that grew more restrictive with each passing week. The Gothic church tower, which had called villagers to prayer for 8 centuries, was now crowned with German radio equipment that monitored Allied communications. Every aspect of daily life had become a chess game played against an opponent who held all the advantages. Food rationing had reduced most families to near starvation rations, with bread allocation dropping to 350 grams per adult per day. Coffee had disappeared entirely, replaced by chicory that tasted of dirt and desperation. Meat became a luxury reserved for collaborators and occupiers, while ordinary French citizens learned to survive on turnips, potatoes, and whatever could be foraged from fields that German agricultural quotas had not claimed. The curfew bell that rang each evening at 8 o'clock was not merely a time restriction. It was a daily reminder of powerlessness. After dark, the village belonged entirely to the occupier. German patrols moved through empty streets like predators claiming territory, their flashlights cutting through blackout-darkened windows, searching for any sign of forbidden activity. To be caught outside after curfew meant interrogation at best, deportation to labor camps at worst. But perhaps most devastating was the way occupation had poisoned human relationships. The Vichy government's collaboration policies had created a network of informants that reached into every neighborhood, every workplace, every family. Children were encouraged to report suspicious comments made by their parents. Neighbors watched neighbors with calculating eyes, weighing the value of denunciation against the risk of association. Trust, the foundation of community life, had become a dangerous luxury that few could afford. Elise witnessed this erosion daily as she made her bread deliveries throughout the village. Madame Durand, who had taught her to embroider as a child, now crossed the street to avoid conversation. The postmaster, once full of gossip and good humour, spoke only in clipped sentences that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Even Father Benoit, the village priest who had baptized her 22 years earlier, delivered sermons carefully scrubbed of any sentiment that might be construed as resistance to the new order. Yet within this atmosphere of fear and suspicion, the seeds of rebellion were taking root. The French resistance had not emerged fully formed like some mythical phoenix. It had grown slowly, organically, from countless individual decisions to say no when compliance would have been easier. A railway worker who sabotaged track switches, a telegraph operator who delayed German communications, a schoolteacher who hid Jewish children. Each act of defiance was small, almost invisible, but together they formed a network of opposition that grew stronger with every passing month. The resistance movement that reached Saint-Rémy in the spring of 1942 was part of the larger Maquis network, named for the dense scrubland of southern France, where many early fighters had hidden. But this was not the romantic underground of Hollywood films. These were ordinary people who had simply reached the point where living under Nazi rule had become more frightening than the prospect of fighting against it. For Elise, the awakening had come gradually, through 1,000 small humiliations that accumulated like drops of water, eventually overwhelming a dam. She had watched German soldiers mock elderly villagers who could not move quickly enough to satisfy their impatience. She had seen children's faces grow hollow from malnutrition while occupying forces feasted on requisitioned food. She had witnessed young men and women disappear in the night, transported to labor camps in Germany, where many would never return. The moment of decision had arrived on a rain-soaked Tuesday in March, when she encountered 12-year-old Pierre Dubois weeping behind the church. The boy's father had been arrested the previous evening for the crime of listening to BBC broadcasts from London. The family faced deportation within the week unless someone came forward to assume responsibility for the boy. In that instant, watching Pierre's small shoulders shake with grief and terror, Elise understood that neutrality was no longer possible. To remain passive was to become complicit in evil. The resistance cell that recruited her operated under the code name Réseau Plume, Network Quill, a name that reflected their primary mission of intelligence gathering rather than sabotage. Their leader, known only as Gabriel, was a former telecommunications engineer who had developed an intricate system for collecting and transmitting information about German military activities. The network extended from the Channel coast to the Swiss border, carried forward by a chain of seemingly innocent civilians who had chosen to risk everything for the possibility of liberation. Elise's recruitment had been handled with meticulous care. The approach came through Marcel Rousseau, the flour supplier who had been visiting the bakery monthly for over a year. His genuine knowledge of grain varieties and baking techniques provided perfect cover for longer conversations that gradually revealed shared sympathies. Only after months of careful evaluation did he finally extend the invitation that would transform her from observer to participant in the Shadow War. Being fought across occupied Europe, the training had been necessarily brief but surprisingly thorough. She learned codes based on traditional bread-making techniques that would be impossible for German intelligence to decipher without extensive knowledge of French baking traditions. She memorized safe houses, escape routes, and emergency signals. Most importantly, she learned to think like a spy while continuing to appear like nothing more than a village baker's daughter whose greatest ambition was a good day's sales. But even as Elise embraced her new role, she could not escape the knowledge that discovery meant death. The Germans had made their position clear through public executions, posted notices, and the fate of captured resistance fighters whose tortured bodies were displayed as warnings. Every morning brought fresh reminders of the price of defiance, and every evening required the conscious choice to continue despite the risks. The irony was not lost on her that the bread which sustained German occupiers was becoming the very weapon used against them. Each loaf that left her bakery carried intelligence that would help Allied forces plan bombing raids, coordinate supply drops, and prepare for the invasion that everyone knew must eventually come. The Germans who smiled and complimented her baking were literally consuming their own destruction, one carefully coded message at a time. As spring gave way to summer in 1942, the war that had seemed so distant during the early months of occupation was closing in on Saint-Remy from all directions. The tide was beginning to turn on the Eastern Front, where German forces were discovering that Soviet resistance was far more formidable than their propaganda had suggested. American entry into the war had opened new fronts in North Africa and the Pacific, stretching Nazi resources across multiple theatres of conflict. But for Elise, standing in her flour-dusted bakery as another day of dangerous deception began, these grand strategic considerations seemed remote compared to the immediate challenge of surviving until sunset. The real war was being fought not in the headlines but in the small spaces between heartbeats, where courage and terror wrestled for control of souls that refused to surrender. The network was growing stronger, but so was German awareness that something was happening in the shadows. Each successful operation brought them closer to victory, but also closer to discovery. The game was becoming more deadly with every passing day, and soon Elise would learn that her greatest enemy was not the Wehrmacht soldier on the street corner, but the polite German officer who had begun taking a personal interest in the quality of her morning pastries. The letter that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday morning in late July, delivered by the same mail courier who had brought news of births, deaths and marriages to Saint-Remy for over 30 years. But this official envelope, bearing the eagle and swastika seal of the Reich, contained instructions that would transform Elise's dangerous double life into something far more perilous. Marcel Rousseau found her reading the notice in the bakery's back room, her face pale beneath the flour dust that never seemed to wash completely from her skin. The document, written in bureaucratic German and translated into stilted French, informed all local food suppliers that a new liaison officer had been appointed to oversee civilian provisions in the Loire Valley region. Effective immediately, all bakeries, farms, and food distributors would report directly to Hauptmann Erich Kruger, recently transferred from counterintelligence operations in Poland. Do you understand what this means? Marcel asked quietly, his eyes scanning the empty bakery to ensure they would not be overheard. His weathered hands, permanently stained with flour from decades of handling grain, trembled slightly as he spoke. Elise nodded slowly. She had learned enough about German administrative structures to recognize that this was no routine bureaucratic shuffle. Counterintelligence officers were not typically assigned to oversee bread distribution unless someone suspected that bread distribution was being used for purposes other than feeding the local population. The first meeting was scheduled for the following Monday at the village hall, where all food suppliers would be required to present their records, explain their distribution methods, and submit to questioning about their customer base. For most villagers, this would be nothing more than another tedious encounter with occupying bureaucracy. For Elise, it could be a death sentence. Over the weekend, Réseau Plume moved quickly to adjust their operations. Emergency protocols, developed for exactly this kind of crisis, went into effect immediately. Dead drops were relocated, communication schedules altered, and backup plans activated. The coded bread system that had worked so effectively for 4 months would need to be suspended until they could evaluate the new threat. But complete cessation of operations was not an option. Intelligence about German defensive preparations along the Atlantic Wall was reaching critical importance as Allied invasion planning intensified. The information flowing through Saint-Rémy included details about concrete fortifications, artillery placements, and troop rotations that could save thousands of lives when the liberation finally came. The network would have to continue operating, but with infinitely greater care. Monday morning arrived grey and drizzling, as if the weather itself reflected the village's apprehension about the new German appointee. Elise dressed carefully in her most conservative dress, a simple navy blue garment that suggested respectability without calling attention to itself. Her hair was pinned severely back, and she carried a leather satchel containing the bakery's meticulously maintained ledgers, documents that told the story of a struggling business trying to serve its community under impossible conditions, but revealed nothing about the additional services being provided to special customers. The village hall, built in the 19th century to house municipal offices and community meetings, had been transformed into a German administrative center complete with Nazi banners, official portraits, and filing cabinets full of surveillance reports on local citizens. The great room where village councils had once debated road repairs and market regulations now hosted interrogations that would determine who lived and who disappeared into the concentration camp system. Hauptmann Erich Krüger was not what Elise had expected. Rather than the stereotypical Prussian martinet with a monocle and dueling scars, he appeared to be a man in his mid-30s with intelligent brown eyes and an almost scholarly demeanor. His uniform was impeccably tailored but not ostentatious, and his French, while heavily accented, was fluent and precise. Most unsettling of all, he smiled frequently and appeared genuinely interested in the welfare of the villagers under his supervision. "Fräulein Moreau," he said warmly as she approached his desk, "I have heard excellent things about your family's bakery. The quality of your bread is apparently legendary throughout the region." The compliment felt like a trap. Though Elise could not immediately identify the nature of the snare, she responded with the careful politeness that had become second nature under occupation, neither too friendly nor too reserved, projecting nothing more dangerous than mild gratitude for official approval. Krüger reviewed her ledgers with the thoroughness of a trained accountant, asking detailed questions about flour sources, customer demographics, and delivery schedule. His inquiries seemed routine, but Elise noticed that he paid particular attention to the customers who received regular deliveries, the very routes she used to distribute coded intelligence to resistance contacts throughout the valley. "You deliver to quite a wide area," he observed, his finger tracing the delivery routes she had carefully documented. "Some of these locations are quite remote. Surely it would be more efficient to require customers to come to the bakery." The question was reasonable enough to have an innocent explanation, but Elise sensed deeper currents beneath the surface. She explained that many of her customers were elderly or infirm, that the tradition of bread delivery predated the war, and that maintaining these services helped preserve some semblance of normal community life during these difficult times. Krüger nodded approvingly, making notes in a leather-bound journal that never seemed to leave his side. "Community service is commendable, Fräulein. Perhaps I might accompany you on one of these delivery rounds sometime. I find that observing local customs helps me better understand the needs of the population under my care." The suggestion sent ice water through Elise's veins, but she managed to maintain her composed expression. "Of course, Hauptmann. though I fear you would find the countryside rather dull compared to your previous postings." "On the contrary," Kruger replied, his smile growing wider, "I find that the most interesting discoveries are often made in the most unexpected places. Some of my most successful investigations in Poland began with simple observations about bread delivery patterns. The threat was now explicit, though delivered with such polite indirection that it could be dismissed as harmless conversation if overheard by others." Kruger was telling her that he knew exactly what kind of operation he was looking for, and that he had experience in finding it. The meeting concluded with standard warnings about the importance of accurate record keeping and the severe consequences for anyone caught dealing in black market goods or providing aid to criminal elements. But as Elise prepared to leave, Kruger made one final comment that left no doubt about the true nature of their relationship. "I do hope we will have many opportunities to work together, Fräulein Moreau. I have found that the best way to serve the interests of both our peoples is through close personal cooperation. I look forward to learning more about your methods." Walking home through the village streets that had once felt safe and familiar, Elise understood that her war had entered a new and far more dangerous phase. The cat-and-mouse game she had been playing with ordinary German soldiers was child's play compared to the psychological chess match, now beginning with a trained intelligence officer who had already demonstrated his ability to uncover resistance operations. That evening, as she and her father prepared the next day's bread in the familiar warmth of their bakery, Elise made a decision that would define the remainder of her war. She could suspend operations, disappear into the countryside, and wait for liberation to arrive through other people's sacrifices. Or she could continue the fight, accepting that discovery now seemed almost inevitable, but determined to extract maximum value from whatever time remained. The choice, when it came, was surprisingly easy. Too many people depended on the intelligence flowing through her bakery. Too many lives hung in the balance to justify retreat. If Hauptmann Kruger wanted to play a game of detection and deception, she would give him a worthy opponent. But first, she would need to become far more clever than she had ever been before. The simple coding system that had worked against ordinary soldiers would not suffice against a professional intelligence officer. The delivery routes that had seemed secure would need to be redesigned. Most challenging of all, she would need to maintain the facade of innocent cooperation while conducting espionage operations under the direct observation of someone trained to recognize exactly what she was doing. As the village settled into sleep under the familiar blanket of curfew, Elise stood at her bedroom window, looking out at streets where German patrols moved like shadows between pools of lamplight. Somewhere out there, other members of Réseau Plume were facing the same impossible calculations, weighing their commitment to the cause against the mathematical certainty that continued operations would eventually lead to capture and death. The war was far from over, but the endgame had begun. Everything would now depend on who proved more clever, more patient, and more willing to risk everything for victory. In occupied France, the summer of 1942 was about to become a season of reckoning that would test the limits of human courage and ingenuity. And in the morning, Elise Moreau would wake up, put on her flour-dusted apron, and continue baking the most dangerous bread in all of occupied Europe. The new routine established itself with deceptive normalcy over the following weeks. Tuesday and Friday, Hauptmann Kruger would appear at the bakery precisely at 9:30 a.m., ostensibly to inspect the quality of bread being distributed to German personnel, but clearly pursuing a deeper agenda. He would examine the day's production with the thoroughness of a trained investigator, asking seemingly innocent questions about baking techniques, ingredient sources, and customer preferences. Elise responded to this scrutiny by becoming the perfect subject of occupation, dutiful, slightly nervous in the presence of authority, and transparently eager to please. She answered his questions with the breathless enthusiasm of a young woman flattered by official attention, providing detailed explanations of family recipes and baking traditions that had been passed down through generations. Her performance was so convincing that even her father began to worry that his daughter was developing an inappropriate fascination with their German overseer. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, Elise was conducting the most sophisticated intelligence operation of her career. The suspension of coded bread deliveries had freed her to pursue a far more audacious strategy. She would use Kruger's own investigation as a cover for expanded espionage activities. The breakthrough came during his third visit. when Kruger mentioned his frustration with the quality of intelligence reports reaching his office from other sectors of the Loire Valley. The problem with local informants, he confided, is that they lack the analytical training to distinguish between significant information and village gossip. I need sources who understand what kinds of activities actually threaten Reich security. Elise seized the opening with calculated enthusiasm. Hauptmann, if I may say so, running this bakery has taught me to notice many things about our community. People often speak freely when they believe they are simply chatting with the baker's daughter. Perhaps I could be of service. The suggestion was audacious beyond anything she had attempted before, but it offered possibilities that traditional resistance methods could never achieve. If she could position herself as Kruger's unofficial intelligence asset, she would gain access to German plans, personnel movements, and security procedures, while simultaneously providing cover for expanded resistance operations throughout the region. Kruger's response exceeded her most optimistic hopes. An intriguing proposal, Fräulein Moreau. Intelligence work requires discretion, analytical thinking, and absolute loyalty to the Reich. Do you believe you possess these qualities? Over the following week, Elise demonstrated exactly those qualities by providing Kruger with carefully prepared intelligence that appeared valuable while actually serving resistance objectives. She reported on villagers who were indeed engaged in black market activities, but only those whose arrest would remove obstacles to more important operations. She identified suspicious nighttime movements, but only those that would draw German attention away from actual resistance activities. Most brilliantly, she began providing intelligence about British agents who were supposedly operating in the region, agents who existed only in her imagination, but whose fictional activities would waste German resources on futile searches. The success of this strategy required unprecedented cooperation from the resistance network throughout the valley. Marcel Rousseau and his contacts had to create elaborate theatrical productions designed to convince German surveillance that Elise's fabricated reports were accurate. Fictional dead drops were established and monitored. False radio transmissions were detected at precisely the locations she had indicated. Even physical evidence was planted to support her narratives about British agents who had never existed. Within a month, Elise had become Kruger's most trusted local asset, providing intelligence that led to numerous arrests and raids that appeared successful from German perspective but actually served to eliminate collaborators and informants who threatened legitimate resistance operations. Her access to German intelligence files allowed her to warn endangered operatives, identify security weaknesses, and plan operations based on detailed knowledge of enemy capabilities and intentions. But the true masterstroke came when Kruger began sharing strategic intelligence about German defensive preparations along the Atlantic Wall. Convinced that his star informant needed broader context to identify threats to these preparations, he provided her with maps, troop deployments, and construction schedules that represented some of the most closely guarded secrets in occupied Europe. Every piece of information Kruger shared with Elise was photographed, encrypted, and transmitted to London within 48 hours. The bakery's basement, accessible through a concealed trapdoor beneath flour sacks, housed a sophisticated radio operation that connected directly to Special Operations Executive Headquarters in Baker Street. Intelligence gathered through her. Double agent activities was reaching Allied planning committees sometimes faster than it reached German field commanders. The psychological strain of this operation was unlike anything Elise had previously experienced. Every conversation with Kruger required multiple levels of calculation, maintaining her cover story, extracting useful information, and avoiding the verbal traps he occasionally set to test her loyalty. She was simultaneously playing the role of naive village girl, German intelligence asset, and Allied spy, with each identity requiring different responses to the same stimuli. The stakes became horrifyingly personal when Kruger began discussing his long-term plans for the Loire Valley region. When final victory is achieved, he told her over coffee in the bakery's front room, there will be opportunities for French citizens who demonstrated exceptional loyalty to the Reich. I envision you playing an important role in the post-war administration of this region. The offer was clearly intended as both reward and test. A genuine collaborator would have expressed gratitude and enthusiasm for such prospects. Elise responded with carefully modulated excitement, expressing honor at his confidence while subtly probing for more details about German expectations for the war's outcome. These conversations revealed that German leadership remained confident about ultimate victory despite growing challenges on multiple fronts. Kruger spoke matter-of-factly about plans for permanent occupation, population transfers, and the elimination of undesirable elements from French society. His casual references to deportation quotas and execution lists provided chilling insights into the fate awaiting anyone caught in resistance activities. But they also revealed something else: growing German desperation masked by ideological certainty. Kruger's requests for intelligence were becoming more urgent, more specific, and more focused on threats that suggested German security services were losing control of the occupied territories. The fictional British agents Elise had created for him were becoming increasingly real in German assessments, requiring ever more elaborate deception to maintain the illusion. By autumn 1942, the double-agent operation had reached a level of complexity that required constant coordination between multiple resistance cells across 3 departments. Elise's fictional narratives had to be supported by physical evidence, corroborating witnesses, and documented results that would satisfy German intelligence analysis. The mental map she carried of her various deceptions had become so intricate that she sometimes lost track of which version of events she had told to whom. The breakthrough intelligence that justified all these risks came in late October, when Kruger shared preliminary plans for a major security sweep designed to eliminate resistance networks throughout central France. Codenamed Operation Harvest, the campaign would coordinate actions by Wehrmacht units, Gestapo operatives and French milice collaborators to arrest suspected resistors, destroy communication networks, and demonstrate German strength before the coming winter. The intelligence Elise transmitted to London about Operation Harvest allowed Allied planners to coordinate their own counter-operation, codenamed Torchlight, designed to extract key personnel, relocate vital equipment, and prepare for expanded resistance activities in the aftermath of the German sweep. More importantly, it provided Allied forces with detailed intelligence about German security procedures, personnel assignments, and operational capabilities that would prove invaluable when planning for the eventual invasion of occupied Europe. But even as Elise savoured the strategic victory her double-agent work had achieved, she could not escape the growing certainty that her time was running out. Kruger's tests were becoming more sophisticated, his questions more probing, and his casual surveillance more comprehensive. She had noticed German operatives photographing the bakery's customers, timing her daily routines, and conducting discreet inquiries about her personal life and family history. Most ominously, she had begun to detect subtle changes in Kruger's behavior that suggested he might be developing suspicions about his prize informant. His compliments were becoming more elaborate, his questions more indirect, and his casual references to the fate of discovered spies more frequent. The hunter was beginning to wonder if his prey might actually be a predator in disguise. As winter approached and the war entered its 4th year, Elise understood that the greatest test of her courage and ingenuity still lay ahead. She had successfully deceived one of the Reich's most capable intelligence officers for 6 months, but maintaining that deception while continuing her espionage activities would require reserves of cunning and determination that she was not certain she possessed. The endgame was approaching, and soon she would discover whether her elaborate web of lies and misdirection would hold long enough to serve the cause of liberation, or whether the mathematics of espionage would finally catch up with the baker's daughter who had dared to spy on the Third Reich. Winter arrived early in the Loire Valley that year, bringing with it a bone-deep cold that seemed to seep through stone walls and settle permanently in human souls. The bakery's ancient ovens, which had provided warmth and comfort for generations, now struggled against temperatures that made flour handling difficult and bread delivery treacherous. But for Elise, the seasonal challenges were secondary concerns compared to the increasingly dangerous game she was playing with Hauptmann Kruger. The operation that would ultimately expose her began with what appeared to be a routine request. In mid-December, Kruger informed her that German High Command required detailed intelligence about resistance escape routes through the forest region northwest of Orleans. British agents, he explained, were apparently using these paths to move between safe houses, and German forces needed precise information to plan interdiction operations. What Kruger did not know was that these particular forest paths were indeed being used by Allied operatives, not fictional British agents, but real SOE officers preparing for expanded sabotage operations against German supply lines. The intelligence he was requesting would compromise one of the most important covert networks in central France, potentially exposing dozens of operatives to capture and execution. For the first time since beginning her double-agent activities, Elise found herself unable to provide the misdirection that had characterized all her previous reports. The Germans were asking for information that she could not fabricate without destroying legitimate Allied operations, but refusing to provide it would certainly expose her true loyalties. She needed a solution that would satisfy Kruger's requirements while protecting the people whose lives depended on her continued deception. The answer came through Marcel Rousseau, whose contacts in the regional resistance network had developed an audacious plan called Operation Mousehole. Rather than simply refusing to provide the requested intelligence, they would give the Germans exactly what they wanted, but on a timeline that served Allied rather than Nazi objectives. Over the course of 3 weeks, Elise provided Kruger with meticulously detailed information about forest paths, safe houses and meeting points used by British agents. Every piece of intelligence was accurate, carefully verified, and precisely what German forces needed to plan successful interdiction operations. The only detail she failed to mention was that all of these locations had been abandoned 2 days before she reported their existence to her German handler. The resulting German operations were spectacular failures that appeared to be near misses. Wehrmacht units would arrive at safe houses to find evidence of recent British occupation, cold ashes in fireplaces, food containers with English labels, even deliberately planted items of British military equipment, but no actual agents. Radio transmissions would be detected from coordinates Elise had provided, but the transmission sites would be empty by the time German direction-finding teams arrived. From Kruger's perspective, these operations demonstrated that his intelligence was accurate, but that British agents possessed security procedures more sophisticated than German forces had anticipated. Rather than suspecting his star informant, he praised her work and requested even more detailed information about British operational methods. This success, however, came at a terrible price. Creating the elaborate deception required for Operation Mousehole had necessitated moving numerous resistance operatives from established safe positions to new locations that were less secure and more exposed to German surveillance. The fictional British agents that Elise had created for Kruger were becoming increasingly real in the minds of German intelligence analysts, who were devoting substantial resources to hunting phantoms that threatened to expose actual Allied operations. Most dangerously, the success of her intelligence reports had elevated Kruger's status within the German security apparatus. He was now reporting directly to regional Gestapo headquarters in Tours, and his operations were being coordinated with Wehrmacht intelligence units across multiple sectors. The simple village baker's daughter, who had begun by hiding coded messages in bread loaves, was now influencing German strategic planning at the army group level. The pressure of maintaining her multiple identities under this level of scrutiny was taking a physical toll that became increasingly difficult to conceal. Elise found herself losing weight despite access to better food through her German connections, developing a nervous tremor that she blamed on cold weather, and experiencing insomnia that left her exhausted during the demanding daily performances her survival required. Her father, Henri, began to notice changes in his daughter's behavior that worried him deeply. She would sometimes stare into space during bread preparation, lost in calculations that had nothing to do with baking. She jumped at unexpected sounds, spoke in carefully measured sentences even during private family conversations, and displayed a hypervigilance that suggested someone living in constant fear of discovery. But Henri Moreau was himself more perceptive than either Germans or resistance operatives had realized. The old baker had survived World War I, the Spanish flu pandemic, economic depression, and now occupation, through a combination of practical wisdom and careful observation of human nature. He had noticed the changes in his daughter's routine, the subtle modifications to bread recipes, and the careful way she selected loaves for certain customers. Most tellingly, he had observed that German interest in his bakery far exceeded what simple bread quality would justify. The conversation that changed everything took place on a snowy evening in January 1943, after the bakery had closed and father and daughter sat sharing thin soup in the small apartment above their shop. Henri waited until the village was completely quiet, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Elise, I need you to know that whatever you are doing, whatever risks you are taking, you are not alone. I may be old, but I am not blind, and I am not a coward. If there is a way I can help, you need only ask." The relief of finally sharing her burden with someone who loved her unconditionally was so overwhelming that Elise broke down completely, sobbing against her father's shoulder, while years of accumulated fear and tension poured out in broken whispers. She told him everything: the coded bread, the double agent operation, the German officer who smiled while planning mass murder, and the growing certainty that discovery was only a matter of time. Henri listened without judgment, asking practical questions that revealed a strategic mind hidden beneath his humble baker's exterior. When Elise finished her confession, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking with calm determination. "We must assume that someone in the village is watching us for the Germans," he said finally. "Trust no one completely, not even neighbors we have known for decades. But we must also assume that you are too valuable to the resistance to sacrifice unnecessarily. If the situation becomes impossible, there must be an escape plan." Together, they began preparing for the crisis they both knew was coming. Hidden behind flour sacks in the bakery's basement, they created an emergency cache containing false identity papers, money, warm clothing, and a coded list of safe houses stretching from the Loire Valley to the Swiss border. They established signals and procedures for emergency communication, and they planned escape routes that would allow Elise to disappear within minutes if her cover was blown. But even as they prepared for the worst, neither father nor daughter could have anticipated how quickly their carefully constructed world would collapse. The betrayal that would ultimately destroy their operation was already in motion, set in train by human weaknesses that no amount of planning could address. In the village of Saint-Rémy, the winter of 1943 was about to become a season of reckoning that would test the limits of courage, loyalty, and love in ways that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The baker's daughter, who had dared to spy on the Third Reich, was about to discover that the most dangerous enemies were not always the ones wearing enemy uniforms. The trap was closing, and soon there would be nowhere left to run. The betrayal came from the last person Elise would have suspected, Marie Petitjean, the seamstress who had mended her clothes since childhood and whose own son had died fighting Germans during the 1940 campaign. Marie's motivation was not ideology or greed, but something far more heartbreaking: the desperate hope that cooperation with occupying forces might save her, remaining family members from deportation to German labor camps. The fun sequence of events that led to exposure began on February 3rd, 1943, when Marie observed Elise emerging from the forest path behind the village at an unusual hour, carrying what appeared to be an empty bread basket. This detail might have passed unnoticed by most observers, but Marie possessed the suspicious mindset that occupation had cultivated in many civilians. She began watching the bakery with the careful attention of someone whose survival depended on understanding her neighbors' secrets. Over the following weeks, Marie documented a pattern of behavior that seemed inconsistent with simple bread delivery. She noted the specific customers who received Elise's personal attention, the timing of her routes, and the carefully casual way she interacted with certain villagers who had reputations for anti-German sentiment. Most damning of all, she observed Elise making deliveries to locations where no customers officially lived: abandoned buildings, forest clearings, and rural crossroads that served no apparent commercial purpose. The decision to inform German authorities was not made lightly. Marie spent sleepless nights weighing her loyalties to a community that had supported her family for generations against her terror of losing her, remaining son and daughter to the increasingly aggressive German labor conscription program. When Kruger's office announced rewards for information about resistance activities, she convinced herself that betraying one person might save many others. The report she submitted to German authorities on February 28th was devastatingly thorough. Marie had documented dates, times, locations, and suspected associates with the precision of a trained investigator. She identified the forest paths Elise used for clandestine meetings, the customers who received special attention, and the subtle changes in bakery operations that had occurred since German interest in the establishment began. Most crucially, Marie had noticed what professional German surveillance had missed. Elise's behavior patterns changed significantly on days when she met with Hauptmann Kruger. Rather than appearing nervous in the presence of German authority, she displayed a confident familiarity that suggested a relationship more complex than simple interrogation. A loyal French citizen, Marie reasoned, would not appear so comfortable with enemy officers unless collaboration was involved. Kruger received Marie's report on March the 2nd, and his reaction revealed just how sophisticated his own investigation had become. Rather than expressing surprise at allegations against his prize informant, he smiled with the satisfaction of a chess player whose carefully planned trap was finally springing. He had been suspicious of Elise Moreau for weeks, but had lacked evidence concrete enough to justify action against someone who had provided such valuable intelligence. Marie's observations provided the missing pieces he needed to complete a very different puzzle. The test that would determine Elise's fate was designed with diabolical cleverness. On March 5th, Kruger informed her that German intelligence had identified a British agent operating in the village itself, someone who had infiltrated the community so successfully that they were beyond suspicion. He needed her help to identify this agent, whose capture would represent a major victory for Reich security services. The fictional agent Kruger described possessed characteristics carefully chosen to match Elise's own operational profile. The spy was reportedly young, female, and using a local business as cover for intelligence activities. She had been active for approximately 8 months, exactly the duration of Elise's double agent operation. Most unsettling of all, this agent was apparently using the same forest paths and safe houses that Elise had reported in her own intelligence summaries. Elise understood immediately that she was being tested, but the nature of the test remained unclear. Was Kruger simply gauging her analytical abilities, or had he somehow discovered her true loyalties? She responded with carefully measured enthusiasm, expressing eagerness to help capture this dangerous enemy while probing for more specific details about German intelligence methods. The conversation that sealed her fate took place in the bakery's front room on March 8th, with morning sunlight streaming through windows that had watched this drama unfold for months. Kruger sat at the small table where he had consumed dozens of meals, sipping coffee made from beans that had become increasingly rare as the war progressed. His manner was relaxed, almost conversational, but Elise detected an undercurrent of tension that suggested important decisions were being made. "I have given considerable thought to your question about investigative methods," Kruger said, stirring sugar into his coffee with deliberate precision. "The key to successful counterintelligence work is understanding that the most dangerous spies are often those who appear most helpful to our cause. They gain access by providing valuable intelligence, then use that access to serve enemy objectives." Elise felt ice water flow through her veins, but maintained her expression of interested attention. "That seems remarkably sophisticated, Hauptmann. Surely such operatives would be detected quickly." "One would think so," Kruger replied, his smile growing broader. "But these agents often possess psychological profiles that make detection extremely difficult. They are typically intelligent, resourceful, and capable of maintaining multiple identities simultaneously. Most challenging of all, they often provide intelligence that appears genuinely valuable, making their handlers reluctant to suspect deception." The trap was now fully revealed, but Elise realized that confession would serve no purpose beyond satisfying Kruger's ego. She had to assume that her resistance contacts were monitoring the situation and preparing contingency responses. Her responsibility was to maintain the deception as long as possible while providing her network with time to activate emergency protocols. "How fortunate that you have identified this agent," she said with manufactured enthusiasm. "When do you expect to make the arrest?" Kruger's response removed any remaining doubt about her situation. "The arrest will take place very soon, Fräulein Moreau. Very soon indeed. I believe the agent in question will be quite surprised by how much we have learned about their activities." That evening, as Elise prepared what she knew would be her final batch of bread in the family bakery, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 18 months earlier, she had been nothing more than a village girl whose greatest ambition was helping her father maintain their small business. Now she was a trained spy whose intelligence work had influenced Allied strategic planning and saved countless lives. The transformation had required sacrifices that were only now becoming apparent. She had lost her innocence, her sense of security, and ultimately her future. But she had gained something more valuable, the knowledge that ordinary people could perform extraordinary acts of courage when circumstances demanded heroism. Henri Moreau understood what was happening without requiring explanation. Father and daughter worked side by side in companionable silence, following routines that had comforted them through years of hardship and uncertainty. When the bread was finished and the ovens banked for the night, Henri embraced his daughter with wordless love and pride. "You have honored our family name," he whispered. "Whatever happens tomorrow, remember that you chose to fight rather than surrender. That choice will outlive all of us." At dawn on March 9, 1943, German military vehicles surrounded the Moreau bakery. Hauptmann Erich Kruger, accompanied by Gestapo officers from Tours and Wehrmacht security personnel, entered the building where he had consumed so many pleasant meals while hunting the most elusive spy in occupied France. They found Elise Moreau exactly where she was supposed to be, standing behind the counter in her flour-dusted apron, ready to serve the day's first customers. She showed no surprise at their arrival, no fear at the sight of drawn weapons, and no inclination to run or resist. Instead, she smiled with the quiet dignity of someone who had already won the only victory that mattered. "Guten Morgen, Hauptmann," she said calmly. "I have fresh bread prepared if you would care for some." The arrest of the baker's daughter, who had dared to spy on the Third Reich, was finally complete. But the real victory belonged to the resistance network she had served so faithfully, and the Allied forces who would soon use her intelligence to liberate the village where she had chosen to make her stand against tyranny. The war was far from over, but Elise Moreau had already achieved immortality. The interrogation cell in Tours, where they brought Elise, measured exactly 8 feet by 10 feet, with stone walls that wept moisture and a single barred window placed too high to provide any view beyond grey sky. The furnishings consisted of a wooden chair bolted to the floor, a metal bucket that served multiple unpleasant purposes, and a cot that was more symbolic than functional. This was where the Third Reich conducted its most serious conversations with enemies of the state. Kruger arrived on the second day of her imprisonment, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the satisfied expression of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. He settled into the room's second chair, brought specifically for his use, and opened the portfolio to reveal photographs, documents and transcripts that represented months of investigation into her activities. "I must confess, Fräulein Moreau, that you provided me with the most intellectually stimulating challenge of my career," he began, his tone conversational despite their grim surroundings. "The quality of your deception was truly remarkable. Even now, reviewing the evidence, I find myself admiring the sophistication of your operation." Elise remained silent, having decided that dignified resistance served her cause better than defiant speeches. She had been trained to expect psychological manipulation, physical torture, and promises of leniency that would prove worthless. Her responsibility was to reveal nothing that would compromise other operatives while maintaining whatever shreds of honor remained available to her. Kruger seemed genuinely disappointed by her lack of response. "Come now, surely you must be curious about how we detected your activities. Professional pride, if nothing else, should make you interested in learning where your methods failed." When she continued to maintain silence, he proceeded with his revelation anyway, apparently unable to resist explaining his investigative brilliance to someone capable of appreciating its subtlety. "The breakthrough came when I realized that your intelligence was too good," he said, spreading photographs across the small table between them. "A genuine informant, even one with access to resistance activities, could not possibly have provided information of such consistent accuracy and strategic value. Only someone with direct access to Allied planning could have known precisely which intelligence would be most useful to our forces." The photographs showed locations throughout the Loire Valley where German operations had been conducted based on her reports. Each image documented the evidence of British agent activity that had convinced German commanders they were successfully disrupting enemy operations. What the photographs actually revealed was the elaborate theatrical production that Réseau Plume had mounted to support her deception. "Your network's attention to detail was extraordinary," Kruger continued, his professional admiration evident despite the circumstances. "False radio transmissions, planted equipment, even staged evidence of British operational methods. The resources required for such an operation indicated a level of organization far beyond anything we had previously encountered in occupied France." Elise studied the photographs with careful attention, noting which locations had been compromised and which remained secret. The intelligence Kruger was inadvertently providing about German investigative methods would be valuable to surviving resistance operatives, assuming she could find a way to communicate it before her inevitable execution. "But the detail that finally convinced me of your true loyalty," Kruger said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone delivering a crucial revelation, "was the quality of your performance during our conversations. A genuine collaborator would have displayed the psychological characteristics of someone who had betrayed their community for personal advantage. You showed none of those signs. Instead, you demonstrated the confidence and analytical thinking of someone playing a role for strategic purposes." The irony was devastating. Her very success at deception had ultimately betrayed her, creating patterns of behavior that revealed her true loyalties to someone trained to recognize such subtlety. She had been undone not by operational errors or security breaches, but by her own competence. Over the following days, Kruger returned repeatedly to continue conversations that served no apparent interrogative purpose beyond satisfying his intellectual curiosity about her methods and motivations. He seemed genuinely puzzled by her decision to risk everything for a cause that offered no personal benefits, struggling to understand patriotism that transcended self-interest. "Help me understand," he said during one of these sessions. what you hope to achieve through these activities. Even if the Allies eventually win this war, which is by no means certain, your individual contribution will be forgotten by history. No one will remember the baker's daughter who died in a German prison. What possible satisfaction could that provide? For the first time since her arrest, Elise chose to respond directly to his question. Hauptmann, you speak of satisfaction as if that were the point of resistance. But some things are worth doing regardless of personal cost or recognition. The satisfaction comes from knowing that you chose to fight rather than submit, regardless of the outcome. Kruger made notes in his ever-present journal, apparently fascinated by a psychological profile so different from his own. And yet your death will serve no practical purpose. Your network has been compromised, your intelligence value eliminated, and your example will inspire no one, because no one will know what you did. Perhaps, Elise replied quietly, but that assumes that victory is measured only in terms of immediate tactical results. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that take place in individual human hearts, where courage is chosen over fear and principle over convenience. These philosophical discussions continued for nearly 2 weeks while German security services conducted raids throughout the region based on intelligence extracted from captured resistance material. Kruger's interrogation techniques were more sophisticated than simple physical torture, relying instead on psychological pressure designed to break down resistance through isolation, uncertainty, and the gradual revelation of how completely her network had been penetrated. But even as German forces achieved tactical successes against resistance cells throughout central France, larger strategic developments were undermining the foundations of Nazi control over occupied Europe. The disaster at Stalingrad had cost Germany an entire army and demonstrated that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. Allied bombing campaigns were reaching deeper into German territory, while resistance movements across Europe were coordinating their activities with increasing effectiveness. Most importantly, for Elise's situation, Allied intelligence services were beginning to implement massive prisoner exchange programs designed to recover valuable operatives before they could be eliminated by German security forces. The intelligence she had provided about German defensive preparations along the Atlantic Wall had proved so valuable that Special Operations Executive was prepared to sacrifice other assets to secure her release. The negotiation that would determine her fate was conducted through Swiss diplomatic channels, with British intelligence offering to exchange captured German agents for Allied operatives held in Reich prisons. Elise's name appeared on a list of 12 SOE agents, whose intelligence value justified extraordinary measures for recovery. But these diplomatic efforts were racing against time. German policy regarding captured spies had become increasingly harsh as the war turned against the Reich, with standing orders calling for immediate execution of Allied agents rather than lengthy imprisonment. Kruger's investigation had already provided German forces with sufficient intelligence to justify proceeding with her death sentence. The decision that saved her life came from an unexpected source. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS and architect of Nazi terror policies, had begun quietly exploring possibilities for negotiated peace that would preserve some remnant of German power in occupied Europe. The prisoner exchange programs represented one avenue for establishing diplomatic contact with Allied governments while demonstrating Nazi willingness to observe international law regarding treatment of captured personnel. On March 28, 1943, Kruger received orders from Berlin directing him to preserve Elise Moreau for possible inclusion in future prisoner exchanges. Her execution was postponed indefinitely, and she was transferred to a military prison facility where conditions were marginally less barbaric than Gestapo interrogation centers. The news reached her through whispered conversations with other prisoners who had learned to communicate despite strict prohibitions against contact. Among them was Father Benoit, the village priest who had been arrested for providing sanctuary to Jewish refugees. His presence in the prison revealed how completely German security forces had penetrated Saint-Remy's community of resistance. "Child," he whispered during a brief moment when guards were distracted, "your courage has inspired the entire village. People speak of you as a symbol of what ordinary citizens can accomplish when they choose to fight tyranny rather than submit to it." But even as Elise drew comfort from these words, she understood that her personal fate remained uncertain. Diplomatic negotiations were notoriously unpredictable, and German policies could change without warning. She might live to see liberation, or she might be executed tomorrow depending on military developments beyond her knowledge or control. In the meantime, she settled into the strange routine of prison life, marking time while the war that had defined her adult existence continued its inexorable progress towards some distant resolution. She had given everything she possessed to the cause of freedom, and now all that remained was to wait with whatever dignity she could maintain for history to render its final verdict. The baker's daughter, who had dared to spy on the Third Reich, had completed her mission. Whether she would live to see its ultimate success remained in the hands of forces far beyond her ability to influence. But in the quiet moments between interrogations, as she listened to Allied bombers passing overhead toward targets in Germany, Elise Moreau allowed herself to believe that the bread she had baked with such dangerous care would ultimately nourish the freedom for which she had sacrificed everything. The liberation of Saint-Remy came not with the dramatic fanfare of Hollywood films, but with the grinding, methodical advance of war-weary soldiers who had fought their way across half of Europe. On August 23, 1944, elements of the American Third Army reached the Loire Valley as part of the Great Allied Offensive that was finally driving German forces back toward their homeland. Elise first learned of the approaching liberation through the changed behavior of her German captors. Guards who had once maintained strict discipline began disappearing from their posts, replaced by older men and barely trained teenagers who seemed more concerned with planning their own escapes than maintaining prison security. The daily interrogations ceased abruptly, and meals became even more irregular as German supply lines collapsed under pressure from advancing Allied forces. The actual moment of her freedom arrived without ceremony at 2:17 p.m. on August 24th, when American infantry soldiers breached the prison's outer walls and found cells filled with political prisoners, resistance fighters, and other enemies of the Reich who had somehow survived the final months of German occupation. Elise emerged into sunlight she had not seen for over 5 months, blinking against brightness that seemed impossibly intense after the perpetual gloom of her cell. The American sergeant who cut the chains from her wrists was a farmer's son from Iowa whose French consisted of 5 words learned from a phrasebook. But his smile needed no translation, and the chocolate bar he pressed into her hand represented luxuries she had almost forgotten existed. In that moment, the abstract concept of liberation became tangible reality. She was alive, she was free, and the cause for which she had sacrificed everything had ultimately prevailed. The journey back to Saint-Remy required 3 days of travel through a countryside that bore the scars of 4 years of occupation and months of military liberation. Bridges had been destroyed and rebuilt, villages showed evidence of fierce fighting, and the roads were clogged with refugees, military vehicles, and displaced persons trying to return to homes that might no longer exist. But when Elise finally climbed the hill overlooking her village on the evening of August 27th, she found a community that had not merely survived, but had somehow preserved its essential character, despite everything German occupation had inflicted upon it. The church bells were ringing, not the mandatory curfew tolling of occupation, but the joyous celebration of freedom restored. Smoke rose from chimneys where families were cooking meals with ingredients they had not tasted for years.